Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Monday, June 22nd, 2020. And this week on Friday, it's the 26th, the TAC 10th Amendment Center, we're celebrating our 14-year anniversary. So I'm pretty blown away that we've been able to run this organization for so many years, and it's still growing today. And on this episode today, we're going to commemorate. We've announced, we sent out an email about a half hour ago, and that's probably still sending to some people. We're announcing the release of our annual State of the Nullification Movement Report. And I want to go through a little bit of that with you today, because rather than just only talking about principles and ideas and strategies, it may not be clear if you're watching or listening to the show on a regular basis. One of the most important things we do is try to put it into practice, because we can't achieve liberty by reading books. We can't achieve liberty by watching videos or listening to podcasts. Although you can get a lot of good information to understand the principles, we do have to actually take concrete steps to move things forward. So I'm going to go through a little bit of that report today. It's pretty long, but we have it available as a free download. We also have a printed version that we've started to send out to some of our members and financial supporters who I'm very grateful for. We couldn't get this work done without your help. So today I'm going to go through 3 quotes from leading founders and old revolutionaries that really guide our principles and strategies here at the TAC and in our work. I'm going to go through 2 of the main constitutional, legal approaches that we use for nullification. And then I'm going to highlight some of the issues that we're covering, because the first half of the report, it goes through the principles, the strategy, the constitutional basis, the philosophy. In the second half of the book, we actually go through a second half of the report, which I guess is now printed as a book for the first time ever. We go through how we're applying that on real life issues and making progress based on those principles that I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes. Anyways, I'm rambling on. First of all, I want to let you know my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We're on a bunch of live streaming video channels: YouTube, Facebook, DLive, Twitch, and Periscope, Twitter. We also have archive-only video channels: Brighteon, BitTube, BitChute, and Library, LBRY, library.tv. We also have the audio-only podcast editions, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, Podbean, and elsewhere. You can find all of our archives, all of the previous shows, all the platforms we're on, all the ways to follow us, like our email newsletter, our social media channel. I link to important stuff. In this episode, I'm going to link to a couple of primary source documents, and then how you can actually read through this free 108-page State of the Nullification Movement Report. I'll link to all that, but we do include links in every single episode for you to read and learn more on your own if you find the topic interesting. Or if I covered enough in the episode, then I guess there's nothing else to look into. But you can find all that information, including our membership program, where you can support us and help us get another 14 years and reach millions more people, over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Now, before getting to it, I want to do a couple of shout-outs. I know Idamon is over on YouTube asking if I do shout-outs. Absolutely do. I appreciate everyone joining me, whether it's live or in the archive. Patricia Dance, Idamon, good to see you, buddy. Dan Warsaw, Bob Landry, MRGF, SAH Biochemist. Man, some old school people like Jeff Stewart, too. Good to see you, buddy. Sherry Voluntary, Kay Brock, Ryan Lopez, my buddy here in the LA area, Francis Kelly. Who did I miss? Mickey Whittenham. Daniel Blanchett, good to see you as well. I appreciate all you guys, and I know I'm probably skipping over some people, but I want to get into the information so you guys know exactly what's going on, or at least you have a path on. That's a pun. All my puns are intended. Anyways, again, this Friday, June 26th, 2020. It's the 14-year anniversary of the 10th Amendment Center. When I started the organization, actually, I registered the domain back in 2006. It may have actually been the 25th. I don't actually know. I could probably go back and look, but I've always celebrated our anniversary on the 26th. So I registered the domain. I actually registered multiple domains. I registered 10th Amendment Center, 4th Amendment Center, 5th Amendment Center, and maybe another one. I had looked out there and I saw this website that I had been reading for a while because I was learning more and more about these so-called free speech zones that were being put all over the place. And maybe they have been doing this for a long time, but I'm like, man, that doesn't sound right. And so I started reading stuff from an organization called the First Amendment Center. And over time, I just kept seeing that every time the government promised that they would do something, they would either lie about it, they weren't authorized to do it, or if they accomplished it, it would just cost a zillion times more than what they promised. So we were always getting ripped off. They're always going to war, whether it's a war overseas or a war on a plant or a war on something. When you have more war, you end up with more of what they're waging war on. So they kept creating problems. And so when I registered these domains, I'm just like, I got to do something. And when I thought of 10th Amendment Center through this idea from the First Amendment Center, which is still around, I started blogging on all of them, and I just saw that more and more people were interested in 10th Amendment Center, and that's the one that kind of took off. I just felt I had to do something. My goal was to reach maybe a handful of people with what I felt was the truth, and I guess truth heals. People are interested in truth, especially in a time when we live in universal lies, universal deceit, under the largest government in the history of the world, the largest empire ever. I think people want to hear something different rather than Team A versus Team B, a little different on this and that, but they're just all awful, and they keep growing the size of that government. So anyways, we're commemorating our work with our annual State of the Nullification Movement Report, which we just published really over the weekend. We sent out this email to announce it this morning. And then over the next 2 weeks, and I'll highlight a lot of that on this podcast, on this show over the next couple of weeks, we're going to do kind of a, I don't know, maybe a marathon of emails highlighting some of the most important articles and work and effort that we've done over the last 14 years. And I'll probably highlight each episode on this show as well. So if you aren't subscribed to our newsletter, that's my chance to do a quick promo. Make sure you do that. 10thamendmentcenter.com/register. 10thamendmentcenter.com/register. The design, the layout on that is not really that awesome, but it's pretty straightforward. Just enter your information and tell us what type of newsletter you want to get. Anyways, let's get right to this. And I want to start out with these 3 guiding principles. These aren't really official, but I noticed them come up in my own work. Mike Meharry, his writing as well, and some of the others that help us get the word out. I keep noticing these quotes come up over and over and over. Well, one of them is actually official. And I just wanted to go through them because they have so much impact on the way we approach things. And I first want to go to the great father of the American Revolution. That's Samuel Adams. And this was a letter he was writing under the pen name or the pseudonym Candidus in the Boston Gazette on October 14th, 1771. Let me just pull it up on the screen so those of you who are watching, you can see this as well. Read along with me. It's pretty straightforward. Let us remember that if we suffer tamely a lawless attack upon our liberty, we encourage it and involve others in our doom. And those of you who listen to the show or watch it regularly, you've seen this many times, and I'm going to keep highlighting it because it is so important. We can't just turn to, sometimes, obviously, when you live under the largest government in history, you can't fight against everything all the time. But your mental approach, how you think about these things, I think are really important. You don't want to blow off people who are standing up against one issue or another because you don't think it's the right thing. What's right for you is not always going to be right for somebody else. And we all have thousands of laws and regulations and mandates and orders and all this garbage that shouldn't exist. We've all got a lot to choose from. So whatever is important to each individual, I think, is important to them. But we shouldn't just suffer tamely a lawless attack upon our liberty because that is guaranteed to ensure that we're going to have more in the future. And that's one important piece of our strategy and thought process here. Another comes from Thomas Jefferson in this letter that he wrote to his friend, the Reverend Charles Clay. I think it was in 1790. Let me take a look. Yeah, January 27th, 1790. And he put it this way. The ground of liberty is to be gained by inches, that we must be contented to secure what we can get from time to time, and eternally press forward for what is yet to get. No one should be surprised that Jefferson was not only a radical in his time. He was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. He was also the author with John Dickinson, who I'm coming back to, the previous year, talking about the philosophical basis for taking up arms against the empire at that point. So a radical approach at that point, willing to take up arms, but then also recognized that Jefferson was a great strategist. And I've talked about this in regards to his Kentucky resolutions of 1798, where he wrote to James Madison the day after they were signed by the governor, like, look, we've got to hold to our ultimate principles, but we have to push as far as events will render prudent. We don't want to go too far and blow it and not get anything done. And that's the same message he took almost a decade earlier from 1798 back to 1790. We keep scraping forward because we're not going to get it all done in one fell swoop. There is no silver bullet. Someone who tells you there's a silver bullet to protect the Constitution and liberty, whether it's a candidate or an amendment or whatever, one process, they're totally scamming you. There is no such thing. It's going to take a lot of work and maybe generations to turn this around. So Jefferson said, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. We have to continue pushing forward. We have to always hold our ultimate principles. We don't give up on those, but we grab and we claw back brick by brick foundation. We build that foundation. And then, of course, on our membership cards, which I happen to have here in my new setup, I got to figure out how to get this to focus on these things here, the camera. Well, maybe put it right by my face. There we go. Our 10th Amendment Center membership cards, which go out to annual, 5-year, and lifetime members. We mail those out. It has a Latin phrase that John Dickinson used in his first letter, his signature to the first letter of the Farmer from Pennsylvania, a series of 12 letters written in 1767 and 1768 in response to the hated Townshend Acts, and the phrase was Concordia res parve crescunt. It means small things grow great by concord, and it's really the same kind of thought process that Jefferson had. If he says the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches, that's the same type of thing that Dickinson was talking about in response to those hated Townshend Acts. Small things, every small step leads to a stronger foundation and to larger ones. And he was absolutely correct, because those small steps that were taken that he advised back in response to Townshend Acts grew into something much greater. I did an entire episode on that last year to commemorate our anniversary. I did that on the 28th of June, 2019. I will link to this in the show notes if you want to hear the whole story behind Dickinson's strategy and behind that motto that we have on our membership cards, Concordia res parve crescunt. Going a little further, let's get right into the state of the Nullification Movement Report. We've got it over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report, a bunch of different formats. You can download it in PDF. For some people, I'm able to actually send out a copy as well for some of our members on their renewal. When you renew, I'm sending out, if you're renewing right now, as long as I've got copies on hand, I will send those out in the next few weeks. Otherwise, you can download for free a PDF format. The Kindle version, there's some formatting, but we're doing the conversions for free. I'm not really happy with the Kindle version. I just want to say, but you can read it. It's not terrible. There's just a couple of errors in it that I'm not happy about. But then the EPUB, the Apple and Android version for an ebook, you can download all that stuff. And unlike a lot of other organizations, we're not telling people, oh, give us your email or sign up for this. This is just there. You just download it. You just read it at your own time. You can share it with whoever you want. We don't need anyone's information to do this. We want this information to be out there because a lot of it is strategy. We want people to learn how to defeat federal programs without relying on Washington, D.C. to limit itself. Because the idea of voting the bums out and hoping that the new bums are somehow going to just look at all that power that's on the plate in front of them and say, oh, no thanks, if you can even vote them out. I mean, the incumbency rate is so incredibly high and has been for a long time. Well, there's a huge problem there. So the notion that you can just vote bums out and things are going to change, this is absurd. It doesn't happen. Going to federal courts to limit the scope of federal power is also a very bad strategy. I think a lot of people are starting to catch on to that as well, and literally just going to protest in front of the federal Capitol building and saying, Washington, D.C., you better limit your power or, well, we'll vote you out and go to your courts. I mean, none of these strategies, these three main things that people do are really working. So we go through the strategy advised by many people, primarily James Madison. And in Federalist 46, you've probably heard me talk about this. James Madison gave us a 4-step program to deal with federal programs, whether they are unconstitutional, he used the term unwarrantable, or constitutional, warrantable as he put it, or just bad policy. You don't actually have to have a determination that something is unconstitutional to be able to bring down that program on a state and individual level. What's notable about this, Madison's advice in Federalist 46, is that he didn't say go vote the bums out, go sue in court, go protest. Well, protest he actually did include, but it has to be all in conjunction. And voting the bums out, you don't want to approve people who violate the Constitution. You don't ever want to give those people your vote. The lesser of two evils voting is not working, and especially if that's your only strategy, it's definitely part of the problem. Madison's advice didn't include that at all. And here from our report on page, well, it says page 14. I'm not sure how the layout works here on this PDF highlighter, but Madison gave us a blueprint for practical nullification before the Constitution was even ratified. In Federalist 46, he advised a 4-step strategy to resist the enforcement of federal acts, and this is how he put it. Should an unwarrantable measure of the federal government be unpopular in particular states, which would seldom be the case, fail to be the case, well, at least at that time, it would seldom fail to be the case, or even a warrantable measure, he's saying a constitutional measure, which may sometimes be the case. So if they're authorized to do something under the Constitution, it may still be unpopular. You don't actually have to rely on Washington, D.C. to stop it. You certainly want to go through that process, but it's not your first choice is to ask Washington to stop doing stuff that you don't want it to do, that it's doing on its own anyways. He says the means of opposition to those federal programs, the means of opposition to it are powerful and at hand. The disquietude of the people being upset, protesting, their repugnance, and perhaps refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union, the frowns, I shouldn't just jump over that. Refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. In his 4-step plan, disquietude, upset, protest, throwing a hissy fit, but refusal to cooperate is his number 2 thing. His number 2 thing is civil disobedience through individuals and on a state level. The frowns of the executive magistracy of the state. So the governors are supposed to bring attention to it. Unfortunately, all 50 governors are terrible. Whatever you may think of a particular governor on a single issue, overall, when it comes to the Constitution, they are all awful. But this is what they're supposed to be doing. The embarrassment created by legislative devices, which would often be added on such occasions, so state legislature taking steps as well, would oppose in any state. In a single state, it would oppose various, very serious impediments. And were the sentiments of several adjoining states happen to be in union, would present obstructions which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. So James Madison told us this is how you defeat federal programs, whether you just think they're bad policy or if you think they're unconstitutional. You have protests, your disquietude of the people, refusal to cooperate with officers of the union, governors speaking out, rallying people to the cause, and state legislative devices. We could also actually consider local ones because they're political subdivisions of the state, but legislative tools to actually add to this whole process. None of these were voting bums out or suing in federal court. And at the time, think of this. This was at a time when the federal government, the proposed federal government under the Constitution, was going to be very, very tiny. And even at that time, Madison recognized that a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union would create a scenario, and in conjunction with these other items, would create a scenario that the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. And these days, the federal government is involved in basically everything. In that so-called federal government shutdown, and I got to put that in scare quotes, in that shutdown back in 2013, the National Governors Association acknowledged this as well. They pointed out at that time they were very concerned about this shutdown because, as they wrote it, states are partners with the federal government on most federal programs. And here's a little secret that the feds and the government at all levels, they don't want you to know. But partnerships don't work very well when half the team quits. So we know that a government that is involved in anything and everything, telling you how big your toilet can be, and that is real, what kind of plants you can have, whether or not you can defend your right, your property, your home, how you may do that, all these different things. They tell you that they have control over it. They're involved in everything, and they don't have the manpower to deal with it. Now, surprisingly enough, going further, and this next page that I put some highlights on, I guess I was already thinking about this. I'm just highlighting some of the things that we put in the report, focusing on the notion that the government at that time was tiny in scope in comparison today. And I know some people say, you know, they made it a big government. Well, maybe in comparison to the Articles of Confederation, but it's totally different than what we have under the largest government in history. And I covered Madison's 4 steps in much more detail in an episode. I haven't checked it out in a while, so I hope it's good. Back in November of 2018, relying on elections is a bad strategy. This is Madison's 4-step program to undermine federal acts. I hope you will check that out. I'll link it in the show notes in case you have not seen or heard that episode yet. Now, we know that Madison's approach is very effective in practice, not only because he told us it would be, but for example, in one very, very huge situation, we know it was used, and that was Northern resistance to the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And whether you know about it or not, the fact of the matter is that nullification was not on the pro-slavery side. It was actually on the anti-slavery side. And we have a whole section in this report covering this, so people can see that not only was this thought of in strategy, in words, in philosophy, in ideas, but it was actually put into practice. We've covered some other ones beyond that, but this is a very powerful example of how Northern states used what's called personal liberty laws to nullify the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Going further, this has actually been surprisingly... You guys should know, I am no fan of the Supreme Court. I think it is an awful, centralizing institution that Thomas Jefferson warned us would actually lead to what's called consolidation and then corruption. I covered this last week as well. He gave us warning after warning after warning that he saw the Supreme Court as it was, I mean, early on as well, but certainly later on in the 1820s when he saw how things were actually being put into practice. With John Marshall, Joseph Story, maybe at that point, I guess, he was focusing on. But a lot of issues, and he warned that it was going to lead to the destruction of the Republic. But surprisingly, the Supreme Court once in a while gets things right. Very rarely in my mind, but once in a while it gets things right. Broken clocks, right? And they have actually supported James Madison's strategy from Federalist 46. And reading from the report here, this strategy of non-cooperation has not only been proven effective, it has also been repeatedly validated by the Supreme Court with multiple opinions holding that the federal government cannot require states to expend resources or provide personnel to help it carry out its acts or programs. known as the Anti-Commandeering Doctrine. They sound like pirates, the federal government, when they try to force the states into working for them, or let's say they offer money. The states can actually say, no, we don't have to participate in this. This doctrine rests primarily on 5 major SCOTUS cases. The first one was in response to an earlier Fugitive Slave Act prior. I can't remember what year that's Fugitive Slave Act. Maybe it was the 1793 one. Prigg versus Pennsylvania. That's where Joseph Story reaffirmed Madison's principle from Federalist 46 that even if the federal government passes something, they cannot require the states to implement. They couldn't require states to act as slave catchers for the federal government. The modern cases are New York versus U.S., the Prince versus U.S. case, that's the one with Sheriffs J. Prince, I believe his first name was, and Richard Mack, where they held that they weren't required to help enforce the Brady Act for the federal government. And then NFIB versus Sebelius, this is the Obamacare case. And then the most recent one is Murphy versus NCAA in 2018. So this is a long history, over 150 years of consistently applying this same principle. States are not required, or their political subdivisions are not required to expend resources or personnel to help the federal government enforce its acts. The federal government may do stuff, and the Supreme Court is always still actually authorizing way more than what was originally authorized under the Constitution, but they say, look, if you're going to do it, you got to figure out how to enforce it. In 2018, that was Samuel Alito wrote the lead opinion on that. It was, what was it again? Murphy versus NCAA. He held that the Congress cannot take any action that, quote, dictates what a state legislature may and may not do. They can't tell them to do or not do anything. And he says, even when the state action directly conflicts with federal law, there's a different approach to it. The Congress can't require them to do something or not do something. He says a more direct affront to state sovereignty is not easy to imagine. I'm no Alito fan, but that is absolutely correct. He goes further. The anti-commandeering doctrine may sound arcane, but it is simply the expression of a fundamental structural decision incorporated into the Constitution, i.e., the decision to withhold from Congress the power to issue orders directly to the states. It was conspicuously absent from the list of powers given to Congress, and also is the power to issue direct orders to the governments of the states. They considered this in something called the Virginia Plan. The founders considered this in the Philadelphia Convention, a federal veto over state acts. They thought about it, they debated it, and they said, no way. It wasn't even a close vote. So they actually thought about this, and they rejected the idea that the federal government had a veto over state laws. The anti-commandeering doctrine, he says, simply represents the recognition of this limit on congressional authority. And I did an episode on this as well earlier this year, February 2019, anti-commandeering, the legal basis for refusing to cooperate. I'll include that in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I think that's actually a pretty good episode from what I recall. I hope you'll check that one out if you haven't already. And then going further, I just want to give a quick summary of some of the things that we're covering, because it's not just theory, it has to be put into practice. And we've got sections throughout this report on various things. Sound money. We got to end the Fed. The banking situation is a serious problem, especially that government bankster, the Federal Reserve. We're also talking about surveillance, asset forfeiture, prohibition and legalization, food freedom, dealing with the FDA, which shouldn't exist either, the right to keep and bear arms, the defend the guard, proper authority over the National Guard, and other things like police militarization and the like. We're going into a bunch of different details. So just quickly, for example, here on sound money, and this part was written by Mike Meharry. He did a great job on this. He does such good work on the monetary issue. He says, you simply cannot grasp the economic big picture without understanding how the Federal Reserve monetary policy drives the boom-bust cycle. So as we're going through this economic turbulence, up and down and up and down, the rich people keep getting richer, and they keep ripping us all off through the inflation, the tax of inflation, I guess we can put it. But you have to bring that to an end. And he writes again, for many years, Ron Paul spearheaded efforts to end or at least audit the Fed on a federal level. And he certainly has brought so much attention to this issue. An absolute hero when it comes to shining a light on the problems of centralized monetary policy, things that aren't even authorized by the Constitution. He says, but the powers that be in Washington, D.C. will almost certainly never let that happen. Why would they want to stop their own banker, right? Nevertheless, we find successful efforts at the state level to chip away at the Federal Reserve's monopoly on money, and these efforts continued to pick up steam in the last couple of years. Now, Ron Paul has actually come out and supported a lot of these efforts. He went to Arizona a few years ago to testify in support, personally testify in front of a hearing of maybe 50 people, something like that. He went to Phoenix to testify in support of one of the pieces of legislation that we've been pushing for a number of years. Just a small step. So, of course, we want to recognize gold and silver as legal tender as the Constitution requires. We've got Utah, for example, that has taken this step, and that's led to a private business, UPMA, United Precious Metals Association, basically a gold bank outside the Federal Reserve System. UPMA.org, it's not affiliate. I'm not getting any loot from them, but I just think they've got an amazing business model that's growing and growing. So Oklahoma has taken some steps. Wyoming has taken some steps. Texas has the new bullion depository built and growing. It's open for business. Basically, what we want to do is create competing currencies. We already have them. We don't need to necessarily create more, although I'm very supportive of cryptocurrency. Anything that's outside the federal fiat system, use competing currencies, and we can possibly get what could be called a reverse Gresham's effect, where good money actually dries out bad. When people have an option, and as they keep printing more and more money and they see, oh, the sound money actually holds its value. I can purchase the same amount of stuff. It's going to take a long time to learn this. And these dollars, I'm continually having to spend, well, this fiat paper garbage, this funny money stuff, I have to keep spending more and more on the same products every year or two. It's going to take a long time, but we have to chip away again. The ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. Another issue that I think is very important that we highlight is asset forfeiture. You've probably heard me talk about it on the show pretty regularly. We focus on both the state and federal programs, because if you only focus on the state level program, the federal government has what's called the Equitable Sharing Program, which encourages states to actually treat everything as federal acts and under the federal program. So then they start acting like federal agents all the time while being paid for local police work. This is one of the ways that the federal government helps militarize and nationalize a local police force, turns peace officers into a centralized, unconstitutional national police agency in many ways. So the federal equitable sharing program is very important for people to opt out of on the state level. And we've covered in recent years Arkansas, I believe, well, Arizona. Let me see if I got some in the notes here. It was not Arkansas. Oh yeah, Arkansas, Utah, Arizona, Ohio, New Mexico, Nebraska, Colorado, California, and I think somebody else. I'm checking my notes here, but a bunch of states have already opted out of a large portion of the federal equitable sharing program. I think in most places, somewhere between 80 and 90%, we got to get it to 100 all the time. And many more states have been taking action on the state level asset forfeiture program as well. There's a bill, I think, pending in New Hampshire this year to follow up on some state restrictions on asset forfeiture to get the state out of the federal program in most scenarios as well. I think it's House Bill 1192. We're monitoring that this summer as well. I'm not sure how the legislative sessions are going right now. But asset forfeiture is a very important thing. It's legalized government theft. It actually encourages centralization of power, and it funds a lot of the really bad stuff that happens in local governments too. And the feds are driving this all along. And then, of course, we've got surveillance, whether it's NSA surveillance, it's facial recognition, cell site simulators, or what they call stingrays, drone surveillance, ALPRs, license plate readers, red light cameras, all that stuff. We focus on all of that stuff because it really is a big, giant national blob. You may think that local surveillance is a local problem, but it really isn't. Most of the local surveillance being conducted, when the local governments, the cops, whatever, are spying on you locally, most of the time, they're only able to do that because they're getting the very expensive spy gear, either through grants or handouts from the federal government. And then soon as they collect that information, they're not just doing local spying and stalking people all the time. They're literally collecting the information and sharing through either fusion centers or a post 9/11 product called ISE, Information Sharing Environment. And what may be local spying in Spokane, Washington, becomes a federal product, a federal surveillance tool. So they're all kind of working together in this national surveillance state. But one one of the most popular things, and I talked about this on the Bob Murphy show recently as well, one of the things that we're most known for is our effort to push back on NSA spying, and we covered that in this report as well. In the wake of the Snowden revelations, it says, we asked the question, if Congress won't rein in out of control spy agencies. We were warned by Senator Frank Church back in the 70s, like, look, the power to surveil people at that time in the 70s, he said, could enable a total tyranny. That was back then. And Congress has not only done nothing, but they've also actually made things worse. And they continue renewing and expanding provisions of the Patriot Act and other measures as well, too. So when I was first asked about this and I first heard about it, people were saying like, oh, okay, well, what are you guys going to do about this, Bolden? What is the 10th Amendment Center going to do about NSA spying? I said, nothing. There's nothing we can do. And I just had so many people hit me up about this. So I guess I encourage you, if you have ideas, to message me, because I also got the idea for our strategy to deal with federal gun control, for example, through people sending emails and ideas. And then I do some research and I work with some people and we come up with a process and we get things done. Well, they're not done. We get things moving forward is a better way to put it. And so I had enough people asking me about this that I started researching, and I started noticing like, oh, wow, the NSA, for example, has a serious Achilles heel. I'm just going to give a brief version of the story, but I learned that back in 2006, the NSA actually maxed out the Baltimore area power grid. That's where headquarters, Fort Meade, Maryland, is where NSA headquarters is. And they were running so much electricity to keep their supercomputers going that they maxed out the power grid. And they were concerned. This is 2006. They were barely scratching the surface compared to how many resources they need as they're using today and going in the future. And they were concerned, and the reports came out. There was this popular news reports at the time, and mainstream publications says the NSA was quoted as saying they were concerned about a virtual shutdown of the agency. So they went on a very aggressive search for new locations where they could get cheap access to power and electricity and other resources. One in San Antonio, Texas, they went to an old Sony factory right down the street from a Microsoft data center, so they could probably tap right in because they can leech off of, they can use, I guess, they're leeching off of the independent power grid in Texas. Texas is being used as a tool to protect the infrastructure that violates the rights of everyone. So they're using that power grid in Texas. They're also more famously went to Utah, the Bluffdale data center there. The supercomputers are water cooled. And at the time, it was expected they were going to use up to 1.7 million gallons of water every single day. And understanding the anti-commandeering doctrine, understanding Madison's approach on this in Federalist 46, we recognized that, like, okay, the locals don't actually have to have those contracts. They can just say no, go elsewhere. So that is one of the approaches for dealing with NSA spying that we've been working on. We've got a version of that legislation passed in California, of all places. It actually isn't in effect because it needs follow-up, but there's a foundation for that. We also have it signed into law in Michigan, where there isn't currently a data center that we're aware of, but I think it will create an environment where it's much more difficult. So we need to get this passed in every single state possible, because one of the arguments against it that we heard was like, oh, if you shut it down in Utah, they'll just move to Colorado. Well, no, we want to get the same thing passed there. We got to box them in and get them shut down. That's a very high profile approach. And I think some of the work that we do on other surveillance issues are actually far more important because they have real concrete impact on the surveillance state right now. So when local communities ban the use of facial recognition today, and there are 7 or 8 local communities, California, Massachusetts, and growing into some other areas as well, that are saying you can't do facial recognition surveillance because this is violating the idea of a warrant based on probable cause, particularly describing the person, place, or thing to be searched or seized. So broad surveillance shouldn't be done, because whether you're looking at the federal constitution or the state constitutions, which are often stricter on these things, you cannot do it properly. It's just impossible. So when you ban it, they don't collect the data. If they don't collect the data, it doesn't get shared to other cities through the fusion centers. It doesn't get shared to other states through fusion centers or information sharing environments. So the idea of no water means no data center for the NSA. Also, for general surveillance, no data means no tracking by everybody else. And that can be done on facial recognition, cell site simulators, license plate readers, drones, and the like. So you can read through all of that and get some more details on how we're doing things on that. We've got, like I said, we've got other sections of the report that covers other issues that I think you'll find very, I don't know, very empowering, I hope, because if you look all around us and we see the power of the gun at us at all times, what can we do other than vote for this gross person or this gross person? There's got to be something else, and this is something else, and there's a long, long way to go. But things are actually happening besides throwing hundreds of millions of dollars into elections or waiting a few years for a Supreme Court case, and then the Supreme Court says, no, we're not going to take any of those. And then you got to wait for another round of Supreme Court cases, and then they don't take those, or they rule on them really, their opinions are pretty bad, or they're kind of milquetoast. You can actually do something right now while you're waiting for that stuff to play out. And when it plays out poorly, you still have a way forward. And we sum up the report like this, and I'm getting close to the end here. For those of you who are sticking out around for this long episode, I really appreciate it. You can sum up the core philosophy of the TAC in one phrase: the Constitution, every issue, every time, no exceptions, no excuses. But here's the hard truth. The Constitution doesn't enforce itself. Words on paper don't make anyone start or stop doing anything. James Madison talked about this most famously in Federalist 48. He described constitutions as parchment barriers. And Dave Benner did a great article on this back in 2017. Parchment barriers, not enough to stop tyranny. The idea that you just wave the Constitution and tell, oh, you know, on almost every episode, when I talk about a constitutional issue, I'll have somebody send me an email or leave some comments, say, oh, you should show this to such and such politician, and show this to the president, or show it to the Supreme Court, and then they'll learn what it is. And it doesn't matter if they don't already know. They probably already know how things are supposed to be, and they're counting on you not caring or not knowing. But showing them something doesn't change how they do things, and especially not when you're talking about the largest government in history. There's no way. Words on paper are not going to stop them. And Madison talked about this, and Dave did a great article covering this in a little bit more detail. I did an episode on it as well a while back, but I'm going to encourage you guys to read Dave's article. He says in Federalist 48, he added that parchment barriers had done little to stop the encroaching spirit of power. And he was talking about parchment barriers on the state level as well, because people were talking about, well, this new federal constitution, well, we got to have this tightened up or this cleaned up or whatever. And Madison was saying, like, look, when you get down to it, parchment barriers don't do anything. You can run a bull through a piece of paper, no problem. They have done little to stop the encroaching spirit of power on their own, and insisted that, quote, some more adequate defense is indispensably necessary to protect the axioms contained within written constitutions. And in short, back to our report, constitutions must be enforced, and they can't be enforced by the government they are supposed to limit. You can't count on a government to limit its own power, ever. It just does not happen consistently over any period of time, and government power will always grow if you rely on government to limit itself. You need an outside entity, and the Nullification Movement rewrite is that enforcement mechanism. After years of relying on parchment barriers and expecting the federal government to limit itself, we're now facing the most powerful government in history. But as this report shows, we're making progress and gaining ground for liberty step by step. Or as Thomas Jefferson put it, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. Always so applicable. And following Jefferson's wisdom, we close it out. We will continue to be, quote, contented to secure what we can get from time to time and eternally press forward for what is yet to get. After all, Jefferson wrote, it takes time to persuade men to do even what is for their own good. And with your support, and I'm so grateful for everyone who's here, whether you're liking, sharing, commenting, for those of you who are supporting us financially through our membership program, you guys are all amazing, whether it's financial or otherwise or both. This is how we continue working to persuade people to do what's for their own good. And again, just one more time, I'm pulling up that State of the Nullification Movement Report. This is where you can read it in full detail. This is just really like a highlight reel, and I hope this kind of whets your appetite to dig in a little bit further, to download that. and to read it in whatever format is there. I appreciate you spending some time with me today. I'm not going to have time to actually jump through the live chat comments, but I will look at that a little bit later today. If you have some questions or comments on this, or if you have ideas for future shows, again, if you support us and you want to take some free steps to actually help us get the word out, all of the platforms you watch or listen on are pretty easily triggered. That means the algorithm is very easily triggered. All you need to do is hit a like button, subscribe, leave a review on places like iTunes and elsewhere. All of that stuff tells that algorithm that someone's interested and that it should show the program to more people. And the more that you guys have been doing this, the more people we've been reaching consistently. It's a consistent growth. It's slow, but we're consistently reaching more and more people with this message of the Constitution and nullification for liberty. And of course, if you really want to kick in, there's no better time than our anniversary week, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, where you can join us for as little as $2 a month. And I know some members have asked me recently, well, how can I throw in another, pitch in a little bit more? And you can do that separately. You can make a one-time donation over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Look, I'm so grateful for you spending some time with me today. I'm so grateful for all of you who have been behind the work that we've been doing, whether it's for a day or for a decade. I hope you have a good Monday. I hope you had a great weekend, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.